In 1875, a man in upstate New York started building horse-drawn wagons. 102 years later, his family's company was producing some of the toughest trucks on the planet. And then, in a matter of months, it was gone. Not because the trucks failed, not because customers stopped buying them, but because the very company that was supposed to save Brockway decided to bury it instead. This is the story of the Brockway Husky, the truck they called the most rugged in the world, and the dark, tangled mess of corporate politics, labor warfare, and industrial betrayal that killed it. To understand what Brockway was, you need to understand where it came from. Homer, New York, Cortland County, deep in the rural heart of upstate, about 35 miles south of Syracuse. This was not Detroit. This was not a place where massive industrial empires were born on assembly lines and investor capital. This was a place where people built things by hand, one at a time, and they built them to last because their name was on every piece that left the shop. William Northrop Brockway started a carriage works there in 1875. The man had been a cabinet maker and an undertaker before that, crafting furniture and coffins out of rosewood, butternut, cherry, and pine. When he pivoted to wagons, he brought that same obsession with materials and joinery. Within a decade, his operation was cited as the largest carriage company owned by a single person in the country. 160 workers in a factory complex of 13 buildings, turning out 2,500 vehicles a year. The Brockway name became synonymous with quality across the eastern states, from New York to Pennsylvania and beyond. When William died in 1889 at age 60, his employees led the funeral procession and his foreman lowered the casket into the ground at Glenwood Cemetery. The town passed a resolution honoring him, praising his pluck, nerve, determination, and practical sagacity. His son George, who had been groomed for the role since his school days, took over the business. And George saw something coming that a lot of carriage makers missed entirely: the gasoline engine. By 1909, George Brockway was experimenting with motorized trucks. He partnered with Orrin Chase, an MIT-trained engineer from Syracuse who had worked at the Franklin Automobile Company. Chase supplied stripped-down chassis from his own small truck company, and Brockway fitted them with commercial bodies built by his team of former carriage craftsmen. Between 1910 and 1912, they assembled about 30 of these hybrid vehicles, testing the market carefully. The results were promising enough that George decided to go all in. In August of 1912, the Brockway Motor Truck Company was officially incorporated in Cortland, New York. Capital, $100,000. Partners, George Brockway. His brother-in-law Fred Thompson, a dentist-turned-businessman, and Charles Pomeroy, the local bank cashier who handled the finances. They leased a former omnibus factory on Central Avenue and hired Rodman Reed, Chase's chief engineer, to lead the design work. First-year production, about 95 trucks, the Model A. A 1-ton chassis with a 2-cycle air-cooled engine that had exactly 7 moving parts. They were not trying to take over the world, they were trying to build the best truck they could for the customers standing right in front of them. And that philosophy, that stubbornness about quality over quantity, would define Brockway for the next 65 years. It would also eventually doom them. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Brockway pivoted to full-time military production. They built 587 Class B Liberty trucks for the Army, along with fire apparatus for military installations. When the war ended, Brockway found itself sitting on a warehouse full of surplus Liberty truck parts. Rather than eat the loss, they converted the leftover military components into the Model T, a modified 5-ton civilian hauler that became popular with construction companies and heavy-duty fleet operators. Turning lemons into lemonade. It was a Brockway kind of move. Through the 20s, the company grew to over 800 employees, producing nearly 4,000 trucks a year. George Brockway merged with the Indiana Truck Corporation in 28, gaining a Midwest distribution network that pushed combined annual sales past $15 million. But the Depression clawed that growth back. The Indiana division was eventually sold off. Brockway shrank to its core, doing what it did best, building tough custom trucks for a loyal regional customer base that valued durability over flash. World War II brought another round of military production. Brockway manufactured the B-666 heavy truck and bridging vehicles fitted with cranes and hoists for combat engineering operations. The 6-ton military trucks used Hercules HXD engines, 855 cubic inches of inline-six displacement, producing 202 horsepower and 642 pound-feet of torque. These were brute-force workhorses built to get heavy equipment across rivers and into battle zones. After the war, Brockway carried that military-grade toughness directly into its civilian lineup of single and tandem axle tractors and triaxle dump trucks. Here is the thing about Brockway that set them apart from nearly every competitor on the road. They were what the industry called an assembled truck manufacturer. That means they did not make their own engines, transmissions, or axles. They sourced the best components available from specialists, Continental, and later Cummins for engines, Brownlipe and Fuller for transmissions, Timken and Sheldon for axles, Parrish for frames, Champion sheet metal in Cortland for stamped cab panels, hoods, and fenders. Then they assembled everything by hand into trucks that were custom-built for each individual customer's needs. A logger in the Adirondacks needed a specific wheelbase, specific gearing, and a power takeoff setup for a front-mounted loader? Brockway built exactly that. A construction outfit needed a reinforced double-channel frame for a concrete mixer rated to handle brutal torsional stress over broken ground. Done. A municipality needed a heavy-duty snowplow truck that could survive 20 years of upstate New York winters with road salt, frost heaves, and temperatures that cracked inferior steel. Brockway was the call. Every time. Only a handful of assembled truck manufacturers ever achieved the same kind of reputation. Kenworth and Peterbilt, out on the Pacific Coast, were the obvious comparisons. But Brockway held its own in the Northeast with a customer loyalty rate that was arguably the best in the entire industry. The reason was simple. These trucks did not let people down. This was not mass production. This was craft. Each truck was essentially bespoke, assembled by teams of workers who knew each other by name, who had often learned the trade from their own fathers on the same factory floor. Customers could specify their engine brand, Cummins, Detroit Diesel, Caterpillar, even Mack. They chose their transmission, their axle ratings, their cab configuration, their body style. The basic designs changed only a handful of times across Brockway's entire 65-year run, and that was deliberate strategy, not laziness. Fleet operators loved this consistency because a parts inventory that fit a 5-year-old Brockway would still fit a brand new one rolling off the line. No obsolescence, no surprises. Mechanics loved it because familiarity meant speed and efficiency, and drivers loved it because these trucks were simply, relentlessly, absurdly tough. The frames were double-channel, heat-treated alloy steel, engineered to withstand torsional forces that would pretzel a lesser chassis. The butterfly hood swung open wide for full engine access. The swing-out front fenders were held on by a single bolt at the rear hinge point. Undo that bolt, swing the fender forward on its front hinge, and the entire engine compartment opened up like a surgical theater. No crawling into tight spaces. No skinned knuckles trying to reach a water pump through a gap the size of your fist. These were trucks designed by people who actually had to repair trucks for a living. Every design choice served a function. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was there to look pretty in a brochure. And then there was the mascot. In 1957, a young boy named Jim Duncan, the son of Brockway employee Bill Duncan, suggested the company needed its own symbol. Mack had the bulldog. Why not a dog for Brockway, too? Jim had been watching the popular television show Sergeant Preston of the Yukon and was taken with the Alaskan Malamute. He pitched the idea to management. They liked it. By 1958, the first Husky dog hood ornament appeared on the Model N260TL, a sled dog in full harness, head lowered, leaning into the pull. In 1962, to celebrate Brockway's 50th anniversary, the ornament was upgraded to 14-karat gold plate. It was the perfect symbol for a truck that would not quit pulling until the driver turned the key off. But by the time that Gold Husky appeared on the hood, something else had already happened, something that would set the entire tragedy in motion. In August of 1956, Mack Trucks bought Brockway. On paper, this made sense. Brockway's sales had been struggling through the early 50s. The company was small, regional, undercapitalized. Their market was mostly the Northeast, with some export business reaching as far as South America, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. Net sales had reached about $20 million in 1948, which sounds respectable until you compare it to what the major manufacturers were moving. Several suitors came knocking. The H&B American Machine Company, Continental, who supplied Brockway's engines, the White Motor Company, which had already swallowed Sterling in '51 and Autocar in '53, and was building an empire of former independents. Mack won the bid, and at first it looked like a partnership made in heaven. Mack and Brockway were the two oldest truck manufacturers in the United States, the Bulldog and the Husky. One was the heavyweight champion of American trucking. The other was the scrappy craftsman with a fanatical regional following. Together, they should have been a dynasty. Mack installed James Cambria, one of their own vice presidents, as head of the Brockway division. Cambria oversaw the first complete redesign of the Brockway truck since 1935. A bold new line with squared-off styling, angular fenders, and a look that communicated pure functional authority. The switch to Cummins diesel engines as standard equipment replaced the aging Continental gasoline motors. Performance went up. Fuel economy improved. Sales followed. In 1962, Brockway landed a contract to supply heavy trucks to the United States Navy and Air Force. Military specification, the kind of validation that cannot be bought with advertising. In '65, they introduced the iconic 300 series, which became the backbone of the entire lineup for the next decade. Bumper to back of cab dimensions ranged from 90 inches to 117 inches, accommodating an enormous range of power plants and configurations. The distinctive fiberglass grille insert made a Brockway instantly recognizable from a quarter-mile out. You knew what was coming before you could read the badge. Husky Drive arrived in 1968, a factory drivetrain package built around a six-cylinder Cummins NH diesel rated at 248 horsepower, mated to a 5-speed transmission with 2-speed rear ends. Solid, dependable, torque-rich power for the long haul. If your Brockway had Husky Drive, you got 2 Husky dogs mounted on the hood instead of 1. You had to earn that second dog. In May of '68, Overdrive Magazine put a Brockway on its cover and printed the declaration that would follow the brand into history: the most rugged truck in the world. Not the biggest, not the fastest, not the cheapest, the most rugged. That was the compliment Brockway wanted, and the one its customers would have given anyway. They were not exaggerating. These trucks survived conditions that destroyed competitors. Logging roads chewed into ruts and swamps, mining operations vibrating with dust and concussion, northeast winters with salt, ice, and frost heaves that could swallow a wheel whole and spit the axle out sideways. The customer loyalty was legendary. Repeat buyers were the norm, not the exception. Towns, municipalities, and fleet operators across the Northeast ran entire all-Brockway operations for decades. New York City Sanitation, Philadelphia, the Ohio Department of Transportation. Some of these outfits had never purchased anything else and never wanted to. If you are enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay? Back to it. So how did a truck this good, this respected, this genuinely beloved by the people who depended on it end up dead by 1977? The answer is a slow-motion collision between corporate consolidation, federal regulation, economic recession, and a labor dispute that spiraled out of all control. Each one alone might have been survivable. All four at the same time was a death sentence. The corporate erosion came first. Mack bought Brockway in '56, but left it largely autonomous for the first 15 years. Brockway kept its own engineering department, its own designs, its own sales network, its own identity on the road. The trucks shared some componentry with Mack, but they were distinctly and unmistakably Brockway products. That independence was the whole point of the brand. Then, around 1970, Mack started pulling the strings tighter. The design and engineering departments were consolidated into Mack's own operations in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Decisions that used to be made in Cortland by engineers who had built trucks their entire careers were now being filtered through a corporate hierarchy 200 miles south. The autonomy that had made Brockway special, that hand-built DNA, was being quietly diluted. In '71, Brockway launched the Husky 500 series, a cab-forward design for refuse and urban delivery work. Engines ranged from 185 to 270 horsepower, Cummins or Detroit diesel. Solid truck for tight city work. Then, in '74, came the 700 series, the most ambitious Brockway ever conceived. It used a version of the Mack R-Series cab, manufactured by Scheller Globe, modified with Brockway-specific engineering. Traditional butterfly hood option. Fiberglass, tilt hood option. Modern driver ergonomics grafted onto the Brockway tradition of ruggedness. On its own merits, the 700 was the finest truck the company had ever produced. The timing was catastrophic. The 1973 energy crisis had driven fuel costs into the stratosphere. Interest rates were climbing toward double digits. The economy was mired in a recession that hit heavy industry harder than almost any other sector. And then came the regulation that put a boot on Brockway's throat. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard No. 121. It mandated anti-lock air brakes on all new heavy-duty trucks. The regulation was well-intentioned. Federal data showed that 10 to 15% of heavy combination vehicle crashes involved braking-induced instability or loss of directional control. Trucks needed to stop shorter, stop straighter, stop safer. The goal was sound. But for a small manufacturer like Brockway, producing maybe 350 trucks a year by hand, the compliance burden was crushing. Re-engineering the braking system, sourcing anti-lock components, testing, certification, documentation. All of it cost money that had to be spread across a tiny production run. The giants of the industry, Mack, Kenworth, Freightliner, International, they could absorb that expense across tens of thousands of units. The per-truck cost was a rounding error. Brockway held roughly 0.2% of the total American truck market. For them, the per-unit compliance cost was orders of magnitude higher. The regulation did not discriminate by intent, but it discriminated brutally by scale. And Mack, the parent company that could have bankrolled Brockway through the transition, Mack was hemorrhaging money of its own. The recession had savaged their balance sheet. Pumping capital into a small subsidiary building a few hundred custom trucks in upstate New York was not a strategic priority in Allentown. Brockway needed investment to survive the regulatory storm. Mack needed to cut costs to survive the recession. The conflict was irreconcilable. So there you had it, a 100-year-old company building the finest custom trucks in the Northeast, fanatically loyal customers, a skilled, multi-generational workforce, and walls closing in from every direction, corporate, regulatory, economic. All it needed was a match. The match was a labor dispute. Brockway's workers were UAW Local 68. Unionization came in 55, 104 votes for, 48 against. For 2 decades, things ran smoothly enough. Wages exceeded the county average. Benefits were reasonable. These were skilled manufacturing jobs in a community where such work was the economic bedrock. People raised families on Brockway paychecks, bought houses, sent kids to school. But by '76, relations between the union and Mack were deteriorating. The labor contract expired in October of that year. Mack and the local had negotiated through the summer without reaching agreement. The union rejected a contract extension. Talks stalled. In early January of '77, a wildcat strike erupted. Workers walked out after lunch, unauthorized, no sanction from UAW International. Just anger overflowing. They went back eventually, but on February 8th, the official strike began. March 30th, 1977. Mack announced the permanent closure of Brockway Motor Trucks. 102 years. Done. Mack cited union troubles, and they were not wrong about the immediate trigger. But the deeper truth was more complex and more damning. The strike gave Mack the public-facing justification for a decision that corporate mathematics had likely already reached. The regulatory burden, the recession losses, the small production volume. The strike was the final variable in an equation that was already trending toward zero. One last lifeline appeared. Stephen Romer, a New York attorney, offered to buy Brockway from Mack and restart production. Target date, June 1st. The community dared to hope. But the deal required union agreement on a new labor contract, and the workers rejected Romer's terms. Whether the offer was genuinely inadequate or the damage was simply too deep, the result was the same. The deal died. Mack liquidated. The remaining trucks on the Cortland production floor were shipped to the Elmira branch for completion, but 45 tractors ordered by Inter-American Transport of Miami, destined for hauling cane sugar in Iran, were still unfinished. Mack shipped all the parts to a Miami warehouse, where Brockway managers and supervisors assembled them by hand over several months. No factory floor, no assembly line, just experienced hands and institutional memory doing what they had always done. The very last Brockway, a U762TL with a Detroit diesel 12V71, a 15-speed Road Ranger, and 55,000-pound rear axles, was completed on June 8, 1977, built in a warehouse by a skeleton crew, 102 years after the first Brockway wagon. Over 65 years of truck production, Brockway built approximately 92,000 trucks total. Some manufacturers hit that number in a year or two. Brockway never mass-produced a single thing. Everyone was crafted, and because of that, an outsized number are still running decades later. Brockway was not the only casualty of this era. The 1970s were a killing field for independent American truck manufacturers. Diamond T and REO had already merged and then faded. Autocar had been absorbed by White. Sterling was gone. The consolidation that swept through American heavy industry in that decade was relentless, driven by the same forces that killed Brockway: rising regulatory costs, tightening emission standards, recession economics, and the brute mathematics of scale. If you could not spread your engineering and compliance costs across tens of thousands of units, you were a dead man walking. The small, the regional, the bespoke, they all went the same way. Brockway just happened to be the one with the best story and the most loyal fans, and that loyalty expressed itself in one final, ironic way. In 1975, Brockway had landed a major export contract for 361 trucks bound for Iran, representing nearly the entire year's output. The company was still winning orders, still in demand, still building trucks people wanted to buy. The product was never the problem. The structure around it was. A year after the closure, the film Convoy hit theaters. During shooting, A loaded trailer pulled by a white 72 Brockway 361 toppled on a sharp turn. The tractor went over with it. The crash was unplanned, but the director kept it. In the scene, the character Widow Woman kicks the downed Brockway and abandons it while Rubber Duck carries on in his Mack RS 700. Nobody scripted it as a metaphor, but there it was anyway. The Brockway, brought down by circumstance, kicked and left behind, while the Mack rolled on. The closure hollowed out Cortland, 20,000 people in a town that called itself Husky Town, USA. The factory on Central Avenue was not just a workplace. It was the town's identity, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that outsiders could not easily understand. 3 and 4 generations of families had walked through those gates. The truck show parking lot, the local diners, the hardware stores, all of it orbited the factory like planets around a sun. When those gates closed for the last time, something broke that no amount of economic development funding or retraining programs could replace. The town did not just lose jobs, it lost the thing that made it Cortland. But Brockway people do not quit. In 2000, the centennial celebration brought 76 trucks from 6 states to Main Street. Former employees reunited, stories poured out. And when people left, they said, "See you next year." They meant it. The Brockway Truck Preservation Association formed. A museum opened at the Central New York Living History Center in Homer. Every August, over 100 Huskies converge on Cortland. They drive them. They race them. They prove once more that the trucks outlive the company. One man in Australia imported a 75 Brockway F761 with a 475-horse 8V92 Detroit. Named it Bruiser. A collector near the Vermont border owns 35 of them. Alan Pavlik, who learned to drive on a Brockway in '76, spotted that same truck at a show decades later. Still running, still dented where he had dented it as a young man. Pulled from a barn after 40 years of silence. And then there are the Argentine firefighters. In '59, 4 men from the De La Boca Volunteer Fire Department decided to drive their 1925 Brockway from Buenos Aires to Cortland to trade it in. 17,000 miles, 13 countries, across the Andes on dirt, floating the truck on log rafts, top speed sometimes 5 miles per hour. They arrived on May 7, 1960, 15 months after departure. Brockway took the trade and shipped their new truck to Argentina free of charge. A parade down Main Street sent them home. That 1925 truck, covered in messages from every country it crossed, sits in the museum today. Nobody drives 17,000 miles across the Andes to trade in a truck they do not love. What killed the Brockway Husky was not one thing. It was everything at once. A parent company that treated a small subsidiary as expendable ballast. Regulations that crushed small builders disproportionately. A recession that left no margin for error. A labor fight where everybody lost. And underneath it all, the fundamental, inescapable tension between handcraft and mass production that has been grinding through American manufacturing for over a century. Brockway built trucks the old way, one at a time, by hand, to order. In a world racing toward automation and scale, that model was beautiful, and it was doomed. The trucks were indestructible, the business was not. Cortland still calls itself Husky Town. The factory is gone, but the trucks remain in barns, garages, farms, and shows from New York to Australia, still running, still carrying that gold Husky on the hood, head down, harness on, pulling forward. They do not build them like this anymore. The tooling was scrapped. The engineers are gone, but the trucks are still here, half a century later, still pulling. And there you have it, the Brockway Husky, the truck that was too tough to die and too small to survive. If you have seen one in person, or your father drove one, or you have got a story about one of these things, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, subscribe. We do this every week.